What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Let's Ask Paul. My name is Paul Abernathy, your host as always, and welcome to the podcast where you can ask me questions based on your need to know of the National Electrical Code. So, again, my name is Paul Abernathy. Thank you for joining me. If this is the first time you've ever been to any of my podcasts, I appreciate you stopping by. Hope you'll subscribe for future podcasts. And even check out some of our videos over on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Master the NEC. But also we have some exclusive videos available up on our website over on electricalcodeacademy.com. You'll see there members only. And there's a lot of exclusive videos up there, especially dealing with some calculations and things like that. So give that a check and you might see some things that interest you. All right, before we get too deep into today's show, I want to tell you that today's show is sponsored by the Fast Tracks program over at electricalcodeacademy.com, but you can also get there at fasttrackssystem.com as well. That's fasttrackssystem.com, C-O-M. So check that out if you're learning, you're preparing for an electrical exam or you want to learn the code a little bit deeper. Then that's the perfect place to go and get into our program. You'd be very surprised how affordable it is based on all the information we give you, all the forums you get access to, all the Wednesday night sessions you can join me on live, and I will answer all your questions. So there's a lot of resources well worth the investment in your future by checking out electricalcodeacademy.com. and checking out our programs. If you really want to learn the National Electrical Code, that's the place to be. Also, we're on all the social media platforms. The @ Master the NEC. That's Twitter, Facebook. We have an exam prep forum over on Facebook. So if you really want to post some questions over there, you can get a lot of help there. But also we have the Sparky Hub, which is our own exclusive social media. You just go to thesparkyhub.com, right? www.thesparkyhub.com, the Sparky Hub, and that's where you can go to get all of your pressing questions answered and chime in with other people who are like-minded like yourself. All right, so let's kind of get into today's question. We have one that's been submitted to me at the portal. Again, paulabernathy.com. You can submit your questions too. And this question is submitted and it says, when changing a main residential panel into a sub-panel, you often have SEU cable for your large equipment. Okay. I have some inspectors tell me to put the bare wire on the SEU on the ground bar, and other inspectors tell me to put it on the neutral bar. What are your thoughts on this? Okay, well, again, this is something that you're going to have to work very closely with your AHJ. And again, you've got two different AHJs here, two of them telling you two different things. So I'm going to give you my guidance on this. Now, I'm going to tell you there are rules in the code under 250-140 that deals with the issue of prior to 1995, where you could run three conductors, two hots and an equipment ground. You could run that somewhere. You could run two hots and a neutral. It also would be used as an equipment ground, and that was all existing. And that's what 250.140 is talking about, an existing application. Now, the interesting thing is you would have been okay in that panel with that as service disconnect, so service equipment, and now it's been changed over to a remote distribution panel. So that means that you're going to add a new service disconnect ahead of it, and you're going to be running 4 conductor separation, right? You're going to be running 4 conductors to what was your service disconnect, now is your feeder panel. And you want to make sure that you change things in that panel so that now you're isolating the neutrals from the enclosure, okay? And you're going to be making sure that you install an equipment grounding terminal bus, and that makes contact with the cabinet. So you've got, just like you would if you installed it today, you're going to have to bring that panel up to code, okay? All right, so that scenario's got to take place. So hopefully he's made you do that part of it. So you're going to add a new service disconnect. You're going to put your main bonding jumper in that. You're going to take what was your main service panel now inside, and now is a feeder panel. So you're going to remove your main bonding jumper, but you are going to make sure that you have two buses. One is for your neutral, which is not in contact with the cabinet. And then you've got your equipment ground terminal bus that will be in contact with your cabinet. Okay, we established that already. Now, the question that you're asking is, let's say you have an existing SEU that was going out to let's say a range, okay? And so it's two hots and a neutral. And because you do have 120, there's like clocks and timers, things like that. So you do have that. Now, you were permitted under the rules, under the exception in 250.140, because anything you do new today, it's going to be 4 conductors, okay? The only time you'd run 3 conductors like an SEU to something like an HVAC piece of equipment is if you had no, like an air handler, if you had no need for a neutral, because you still have to have an equipment ground. But if you had no need for a neutral, then you could run 2 hots, and then that spiral could be utilized as the equipment ground, and you didn't need a neutral. And that still could be the case. You don't have to run a neutral to something that doesn't require a neutral. But in this case, there's a reason why ranges today have 4 conductors, 2 hots, a neutral, and an equipment ground. But prior to 95, you were able to get away with it. And we've had this little exception in 25140 that's been there ever since. Now, this applies to the branch circuit. It's existing. This means it hasn't been changed, extended, modified in any way. Then here's what it says, okay? And it will kind of address how you're going to deal with your issue. Now, here's under the exception. It says, for existing branch circuit installations, only where an equipment grounding connector is not present at the outlet or junction box, and of course it's not, because it would have been of the time period it was not. It says the frame of electric ranges, wall-mounted ovens, counter-mounted cooking units, clothes dryers, and outlet or junction boxes that are part of the circuit for these appliances shall be permitted to be connected to the grounded circuit conductor if all the following conditions are met. Okay, so this was allowing you to do this and keep a branch circuit that only was a 3 conductor branch circuit, but you have allowances because now we'd run 4 conductors to things like these ranges. So you have this existing branch circuit, okay? All right, so you have these 4 conditions you have to meet. Now, these are still going to apply. So I'm talking to you, whoever submitted the question, but I'm also speaking to your inspectors. Number 1, it says the supply circuit. So what we're trying to do now, real quick, is determine whether we're still compliant. Right? We have changed the variables. We have turned a service panel into a remote distribution panel. We have isolated the neutrals, so they're not in contact with the metal cabinet. We've made sure that 4th conductor now that is running from the service disconnect to this existing panel that is now a remote panel, we're going to make sure that the equipment ground is in contact with the cabinet. Okay, so we're good and clear there. So let's look at these rules here. It says, number 1, the supply circuit is 12240 volt, single phase, 3-wire or 208Y120 derived from a 3-phase, 4-wire Y connected system. Okay, so this is, I am sure it's still supplied. It didn't change, still 12240 single phase. So I think you're okay so far. Number 2 says the grounded conductor, if not smaller than 10 AWG copper or 8 AWG aluminum. Okay, so the grounded conductor cannot be smaller than 10 copper or 8 aluminum. Okay, next, number 3, and here's the biggie. It says the grounded conductor is insulated. Okay, now with that old SEU, it was not insulated. Okay, but it says the grounded conductor is insulated, or the grounded conductor is uninsulated and part of the SE cable service, the SE service entrance cable, and the branch circuit originates at the service equipment. Okay, so here is the problem. Excuse me. Here is the problem. This was allowed as long as it went back to the service equipment. Now it does not go back to the service equipment. You with me? It does not go back to the service equipment. So you're going to have to work with the HJ, because meeting this exception now that you've changed everything has made it more difficult for compliance. Now, there are jurisdictions that I've heard of that will say, okay, if you can go in there and take heat shrink, again, I'm not saying that's insulation. I'm just saying, because typically, if you're not meeting all these conditions and you change something now and that panel is no longer the service equipment, but now it's a remote distribution, you could have a jurisdiction that flat out will make you now change that branch circuit to those ranges. You with me? They have that within their right, because now they see that you're not meeting this existing rule anymore. And if all the conditions aren't in play, then the exception's not in play. So you got to be very careful, because a jurisdiction could literally say, okay, once you change this panel to a remote distribution panel, you did your separation. Now any of those things like the SEU that's going out to appliance or something, you're going to have to change that to a 4-conductor. Okay. Now, the jurisdiction's going to have to say, well, I will let you use that bare grounded conductor if you will insulate it. Now, that's a tough one, right? Because normal electrical tape, it's white because you're using it as a grounded conductor, so it'll be white or gray. Typically, that is not really insulation. So you could, yes, it's designed to go around lugs and, split bolts and all that kind of, but it's technically not insulation. Okay? It's wrapping for splices and things like that. Now you can get heat shrink that has a good thickness to it and whatever, and you might get an inspector that says, well, I'll let you sleeve that and you can put heat shrink over it and that will make it insulated, although chances are it also does not have an insulation rating on it. So there's no easy way to answer your question, because I can see a large number of jurisdictions going, look, if you're putting in a new service and you're now turning the old service into a remote panel, yes, you might have SEUs that are running out to appliances that were permitted to have it be a 3-wire circuit prior to 1995. But now, since you're changing that panel fundamentally, they may argue that you have to, at this point, either replace it, run a new branch circuit, or maybe you can convince them to let you insulate a grounded neutral conductor. Okay? Now, if they do that, then you forget the part that's after that, the or that's in the SC cable. You try to forget that part because that does not run all the way back to the service equipment anymore. So this is one of the ones where it's so important, the power of the word or, because this says the grounded conductor is insulated, or then you go into these other actions that you're probably not going to be able to achieve. You're not. So you're going to need to talk to your AHJ, see what your AHJ will allow you to do. That is a touchy situation because it does bring costs into play of redoing things. Many jurisdictions might just let you tape up that bare grounded conductor so that it doesn't inadvertently come in contact with anything in there. Because again, it is carrying current, it's return current. It could, put circulating currents and objectionable currents on the equipment. So you want to isolate it out, obviously. So you heat shrink it to all the way back to where it comes in, and again, that's enough to keep it from coming in contact with any metal parts in there as you route it. And to me, if you're allowed to do that, then you're following the rule. And the general rule was, and the exception was allowing you to connect it to the grounded conductor, not the equipment ground. The problem with connecting it to the equipment ground at this stage is that it actually will put return current on the metal parts. And I'd much rather have that path back going to the grounded conductor as it was originally under that allowance before we changed to 4-conductor rule. Trying to stay true to the exception as much as you can. So I would not take it to the equipment ground terminal. Okay. Remember, in that scenario that you're probably talking about, it is being used as a neutral. Now, I say that with the caveat because if it was being used as simply 2 hots and an equipment ground, and only you'll know this if it's like an air handler where it used an SEU and it's 2 hots and it had an equipment ground because no neutral was needed, then yes, then you would make that connection to the equipment ground terminal bus. So as you can see, you need to know what it's being used for. If it's being used under the allowance to be a neutral but also make a connection to the case, prior to 1995 and the whole genesis of the exception under 250.140, then you might have something that they're going to let you do to that grounded conductor. However, if it's SEU, like I said, 2 hots and just an equipment ground, then that would be connected to the equipment ground terminal bus because you don't have a neutral. So and even today, you can still use SEU 2 hots, and you can use that as an equipment ground and still supply something like an air handler unit that only has 2 hots. It's a 240. There's no neutral involved. It's still doable today. That's not a problem. So my message to you, submitter, is either inspector may be correct depending on what that bare conductor is being used for, right? So you need to dig deeper. And if they do say it's being used as a neutral or grounded conductor, then you're going to have to discuss exception item number 3 and see what their options are. Because really, if it is being used as a grounded conductor, you only have 2 options. One, you try to convince them that you can insulate it and be effective, and your condition is what it is, and you're just stuck in the middle of this really old, dated install. Or they're going to make you redo it and put in a new 4-wire from that remote distribution panel to the range, which is what I probably would do. But again, I understand that I'm not in the field anymore, and that's not a perfect world. So I'm giving you all the possible scenarios. And then, of course, lastly, you may luck out and it's 2 hots and an equipment ground, and then you're just going to treat it just like you normally would. The 2 hots go to the breaker, the equipment ground goes to the new equipment grounding bus, and that's it, and you're done with it. All right, so hopefully that's, again, answered that question. It's a lot to think about. It's not something that we're dealing in a perfect world because you're kind of hodgepodging it a little bit, but that's the best advice I can give you. So both inspectors could be right depending on what's going on in which circuits, whether they have a grounded conductor or it's just an equipment ground. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Okay, the next question that we have, this one won't take but a second. It says, do you have any prep courses for the Master Electrician State Exam? Okay. So I will say the name to this individual because, again, it's obviously they're the one looking for a course. Toby. Toby, you go over to our website, and our exam prep programs work in all 50 states. Okay. If the code test that's in your state is all about the National Electrical Code, then our programs are going to be able to help you. Okay. So go check out www.electricalcodeacademy.com or the fasttracksystem.com. Again, fasttracksystem.com. Either way, you can even Google Fast Tracks Exam Prep and you'll get to our website. And most certainly they're going to help you on your electrical exam. All right, the next question we have that's slated for the topic. Okay, so this one is, hey, Paul, I have a 3-story cabin. I'm putting a 200 amp service on. I want to put panel on the first floor, which will be below grade. Can I just run SEU cable out of the back of the meter and down to the panel, or do I need to have a means of disconnect since panel will not be directly behind the meter? Thank you. Okay, great question. So this one's going to require us to do a little bit of digging. And I'm going to remind you of a couple things. First and foremost, remember, if you're in the 2020 edition of the National Electrical Code, and I don't know what edition you are, but I always refer to the latest edition, and you didn't state which edition you were under, so I'm going to have to tell you what's in the 2020 edition of the NEC. Now, the first thing I'm going to remind you is that you said that your meter was outside, but you want to put your panel inside below grade. First thing is you're going to have to now have an emergency disconnect, okay? So 230.85 is going to require that you have an emergency disconnect. Now, it could be the service disconnect as well, but you have to have an emergency disconnect outside. So whether you're right there next to that meter and you put a disconnect right there, a service disconnect, which you have a right to do under 230.85, you can put in item number 3. It's a disconnecting switch. As long as it's suitable for use as service equipment, you put it in there right there, okay? And there you go. Now, that is not the service equipment. It just has to be suitable for use. That's just the disconnect. But once you do that, the key problem with that is you still have service conductors that come out of it. And so when you run them into the building, it sounds like you want to run them in and then down. Then you have a problem with 230.70A1, and that is stating that you have to make sure that you keep those conductors and you terminate them inside or outside or inside the nearest point of entry, okay? So when you look at it, it's telling you that you're going to need that service disconnecting means, and they have to terminate outside or the nearest point of entry. And if you're not coming back to back from that meter straight in, okay. Then back in previous cycles, the issue previous to 2020, then you could have come straight out of the meter and straight in, but you couldn't have run those service conductors in and down because they would have been run inside the building and they'd be unprotected, right? Now, every jurisdiction is a little different. Some of them will let you run a couple feet in, but if you want to go literally by the code, it's pretty clear what it says. It says, when you're talking about is the service disconnect means shall be installed in accordance with 230.70A1, and that says what? The service disconnect means shall be installed at a readily accessible location, either outside of the building or structure or inside nearest the point of entrance of the service conductors. So the whole goal here is not to run service conductors through the building, right? So if you were to go from the meter straight into the back of a panel in the old days, and I say old days prior to 2020, then you could have run into a panel and hit a service disconnect there and you'd be good to go. But now what you've got to do now under the 2020 is you need to put either a outside emergency, you have to put an emergency disconnect in. And if you want that to just be a switch, then you still have a problem, right? So my advice, here's my advice. You ready? I would put the meter right beside the meter. I would put the service disconnect. So go get a 200 amp service disconnect switch, put it in. That is now your service. You're going to take your grounding electrodes to that, okay? And then from there, you're going to change over to what's called SER, 4 conductors, okay? 2 hots, a neutral, and an equipment ground. Then you're going to come out of the back of that 200 amp in and then down to wherever you want to put your panel at, okay? And that is considered a feeder. And now that it's protected outside, you've got both the service disconnect and you got the emergency disconnect out there, okay? So, and the difference between that being a service disconnect and a switch I was talking about earlier, because that could have been simply a knife switch, right? That didn't have to have overcurrent protection. That's just a switch. Whereas if you're doing the service disconnect, now you got to have the service disconnect, but then you have to have the overcurrent protection and all of that, overload and everything. So there is a difference. Now, alternatively, you could put an exterior NEMA 3R panel right next to that meter, but it doesn't sound like you want to put your panel with your breakers outside. So the only real option that you have is right next to the meter, put a service disconnect 200 amp NEMA 3R rated. That now is your service. Make sure it's rated for that. You're going to run your grounding electrode conductors from wherever your electrodes are up into it, and you're going to label that emergency disconnect and service disconnect, okay? And then you're going to come on the load side of that. You're going to go from it with an SCR, I guess, or you could conduit in if you want or raceway it in. But you're going to go out of that in the building and then down to wherever you want to put your panel. You're going to run 4 conductors to that, and you're going to treat that as that's your remote distribution panel. 4 conductors, isolate your neutrals. Your equipment grounds will connect to the cabinet and treat it like you would a normal remote distribution panel. And then you're good to go. But you're going to need that emergency disconnect if you're under the 2020 NEC, okay? And so I encourage you to go look at 230.85. I'm thinking you're going to meet item number 1 by putting that service disconnect. Now, a lot of people think that has to be a panel. It does not. You can get service disconnect switches that are designed for that, 200 amps, and it'll have a bus in there and everything. You can take your grounding electrode conductors and everything to it, and then anything that comes out of that is just the feeder that's now extending to wherever you want to put your panel. And we've been doing that for decades. So that's nothing new. I used to buy those, again, at Lowe's or Home Depot or even the supply house, depending on who had the best deal. You know what I'm saying? And it's going to give you all of the requirements that are necessary to be the emergency disconnect. So that's going to be taken care of. Okay? So that's not going to be an issue. But it's also going to give you the overcurrent protection that's also required as well in the code. So everything will take place there. So just put that right beside the meter. But no, to answer your question, no, you can't go straight out of the meter or straight into the building anymore. Just can't do it. Okay? All right, hopefully that answers that question for you. So we got the last question we'll do here. Knock this out of the way. It says, Paul, where does it say in code that a detached garage needs ground rods? Also, if it was full wire neutral and ground, wouldn't the ground rod be redundant? Thank you, so-and-so. Okay, good question. So again, I think what you're asking here is, okay, so we have a detached structure, and we know that 250.32a tells us we have to establish a grounding electrode system there. And again, we're not using the exception where it was just a simple branch circuit going out there, or it could be a multi-wire branch circuit where you'd have actually 2 branch circuits, but for all intents and purposes, for that exception under 250.32a, whether it's a multi-wire or it was a single branch circuit, that they treated the same. So it's still just one to a building. So it's okay. And then you wouldn't need grounding electrodes there. But in this case, you're putting a panel there. You're running a feeder there. You're going to have to establish a grounding electrode system. Now, to answer this question, there is literally nothing in the code that says that you have to have ground rods, okay? So the difference is 250.32a is telling you about that you need to establish electrodes there, and you can use any of them that are listed in 250.52a1 through a8. Now, a1 is the water pipe ground, so you're probably not going to do that there. But you could use rods, pipes, plates, rings, what have you. UFR, you might have a concrete encased, but you have to have a grounding electrode system there. And so I guess his question is, if you ran a feeder out there, then you've got an equipment ground as well as the grounded neutral plus your 2 hots. He's asking, would it be redundant? Why would you need to have the ground rods? Well, that's because the ground rods are for something totally different. Okay, they're for lightning. They're for high power lines. It could come in contact with low power lines. I mean, even that detached structure and those feeders that are going out to it raise that possibility. And so you do have that plausible possibility, plus the code tells you you have to establish a grounding electrode system there, okay, in this case for this detached structure. Now, the equipment ground that's running out there, that is something that's required in 250.32b, okay, for that detached structure. So you're going to have 4 conductors going out there. So this is very consistent the way we do it for ranges, dryers, detached structures now. That's exactly what we're going to do. Now, we need that equipment grounding conductor run there. Why? Because we need to be able to clear the feeder breaker that's supplying power to that detached structure, right? And that's what the equipment grounding conductor does. It allows for the ground fault and clear the overcurrent device. So, and when you get to that detached structure, the big difference is when you make that panel in that detached structure, that you're going to have the neutral bus, which is kind of floating, right? It's not going to be in intimate contact with the metal cabinet. But you're also going to have that equipment ground that you're running that will go on a bus that is in intimate contact with the metal cabinet. Now, those electrodes that you're putting out there, whether you're putting into ground rods or whatever you're doing, they're grounding electrode conductor from those electrodes all the way up to that panel that's in this detached structure now. That's going to make a connection to the equipment grounding terminal bus, not to the neutral. Okay, the neutral is going to stay isolated. You with me? So if you're basically going to have your electrodes connected to your equipment grounds and everything in the detached structure, but you're not going to connect the neutral to the cabinet. Still want to maintain that isolation all the way back to the main panel that's supplying the feeder to that detached structure. Okay, so get it out of your mind when it comes to the concepts of the thinking, well, is it redundant? It's not redundant. The detached garage, okay, that remote distribution panel needs 4 conductors. Needs 2 hots, a neutral, and an equipment ground. Okay, you also have to separate them. Again, the grounds and the neutrals, you have to separate them in that remote panel. And you do have to establish a grounding electrode system with some electrodes there. And if you want to use ground rods, that's fine. So, and they're not going to connect to the neutral. They're going to connect to the equipment grounds at that remote distribution panel. You see what I'm saying? So this would be no different if we did a panel in your garage in the existing dwelling. The only difference is you don't need the ground rods and all that because you're using the premise that your service is in, that you're feeding that remote distribution panel because it's in the same premise, right? Maybe in your basement or something. But when you leave the building and you're going to another building and you're running a feeder, once you get to that building, again, barring any of the exceptions for branch circuits under 250.32a, if it's going to have a panel installed in there, then you're going to isolate the neutrals. You're going to take the equipment grounds, make sure it connects to the cabinet. You're going to run the grounding electrode conductor from the electrodes up to the equipment grounding conductor terminal bus. Again, all of that gets done there. Establish your grounding electrode system with whatever electrodes you choose, and that's how you're going to do it on a remote distribution panel that's going to another building, detached structure, okay? The only difference when it's inside, the remote panel is inside the same building as your service. The only difference is you don't need the electrodes, but you're still going to do the separation as you normally would. Make sense? All right, hopefully that answers that question for you. And anybody else out there, if you have any questions, you have anything you want to follow up, or you want to just ask us something about the National Electrical Code, do me a favor. Just go over to paulabernathy.com and you can submit your questions and I will do my best to answer them for you. Until next time, folks, stay safe. God bless.